Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate guy setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled New York Times, All the Fake Arctic News Unfit to Print. The New York Times just published one of their typical fake news articles about the Arctic. They say, Arctic sea ice has been in steep decline since the late 1970s when satellite images were first used to study the region. Then they went on with, scientists say the disappearance of sea ice is largely a result of climate change. The first thing that caught my attention in this article is the claim that satellite images were first used to study the Arctic in the late 1970s. Given that we've had satellites in orbit for 55 years, it seems curious that nobody would have looked at the Arctic before the late 1970s. I can kind of understand these two kids not knowing about that, but Henry should know better. This claim that they don't know what went on in the Arctic before the late 1970s is central to the fraud in this article. Let me explain. This graph from NOAA is a typical U.S. government graph of Arctic sea ice. It starts in 1979, goes to the present, and shows a linear downward trend. The implication of these graphs is, of course, that Arctic sea ice is disappearing, and it's due to your SUV. But why did NOAA choose to start their graph in 1979? Let's have a look at that. Here's a graph of NOAA Arctic sea ice data from the 1990 IPCC report. This is where the current NOAA sea ice graphs start in 1979, right at the peak, and they're ignoring all the data before that when Arctic sea ice extent was much lower. They're cherry-picking a very high start date. By starting their current graphs right at the peak in 1979, they can create a fake linear downward trend, when in fact behavior of the Arctic is cyclical. It was much lower prior to 1979, it increased, and then it's been decreasing. So the New York Times article is based on fake government graphs from agencies like NOAA. Let's look closer now at this claim that satellite images were first used to study the Arctic in the late 1970s. We went to the moon in 1969. We have lots of satellite imagery of the Earth from prior to the late 1970s. In 1965, National Geographic published satellite imagery of the Arctic taken in 1964. This was taken from the Nimbus 1 weather satellite. That was 15 years prior to the start of the NOAA Arctic sea ice graph. What is it they're hiding from those 15 years? Well, here's a very detailed Arctic sea ice map from National Geographic in 1971. And notice what it shows. There wasn't a huge amount of sea ice in the Arctic in 1971. NOAA doesn't want you to know about that. Remember this 1990 NOAA sea ice graph, which showed that Arctic sea ice extent was much lower in the early 1970s. They don't want you to remember that. Here's some very detailed polar satellite imagery from National Geographic in November 1976. That's 3 years before the start of their current sea ice graphs. So we know that they're hiding inconvenient satellite data from prior to 1979, but this story gets worse. This graph is from a 1985 Department of Energy report titled Projecting the Climatic Effects of Increasing Carbon Dioxide, and it showed Arctic sea ice data going all the way back to 1925. Note that Arctic sea ice extent declined sharply during the 1920s and was very low during the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. So I combined the 1985 Department of Energy graph with the 1990 IPCC graph, and something stunning jumps out. The New York Times started their graph right at the century peak for Arctic sea ice. Well, everything is going to be downhill from there in either direction. The New York Times article is fake news, and it's based on wildly deceptive data being published by NOAA and other government agencies. Let's have a closer look now at what was going on in the Arctic back when Arctic sea ice was low during the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Here's an article from none other than the New York Times in 1958. The Changing Face of the Arctic. Some scientists estimate that the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was a half century ago, and that even within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic may open, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole. So in 1958, the New York Times was predicting an ice-free Arctic within a generation. I found this paragraph from the 1958 article to be particularly interesting. Although the idea that a solid ice sheet covers the central Arctic has lingered stubbornly in the popular fancy, the northern cap of ice worn by our planet is actually a thin crust, on the whole only about 7 feet thick, over an ocean 2 miles deep in places. Well, that's exactly the same story we have now. Arctic sea ice is still about 7 feet thick, and people still believe that it used to be much thicker. People maintain the same Arctic delusions now as they maintained 60 years ago. But after 1958, things changed rapidly. By 1961, the New York Times reported a unanimous consensus of scientists that Earth had started getting colder. And by 1970, the New York Times reported that the US and Soviet Union were very concerned about why the Arctic climate was becoming more frigid and why Arctic ice was becoming ominously thicker and whether it was going to lead to a new ice age. By 1975, many climatologists were convinced that we were headed into a full-bore ice age. Chicago Tribune, March 2nd, 1975. Brr, new ice age on way soon. It's getting colder. In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snowcap has expanded by 12%, and for the first time in this century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. So it was getting much colder, the ice was expanding, and was blocking ports. So in 1975, scientists reported a 12% expansion in Arctic sea ice. Let's go back and look at the 1958 article now. Well, they showed a 12% reduction in Arctic sea ice. This tells us that Arctic sea ice is cyclical, not linear. The NOAA graph starting in 1979 is deceptive, making it fake, as is the New York Times article. Now let's look closer at the historical record. National Geographic, November 1976. What's happening to our climate? From 1880 to about 1940, the world, particularly the Northern Hemisphere, went through a period of significant warming, said Dr. J. Murray Mitchell of NOAA. But since about 1940, there's been a distinct drop in average global temperature. It's fallen about half a degree Fahrenheit, even more in high latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere. So the Arctic was cooling really fast during the 1970s. That's why NOAA and the New York Times are hiding the Arctic data prior to 1979. England's annual growing season shrank by 9 or 10 days between 1950 and 1966, Hubert Lamb has noted. In the northern tier of the U.S. Midwest, summer frosts again occasionally damage crops. Sea ice has returned to Iceland's coast after more than 40 years of virtual absence. Arctic sea ice was expanding. During the last 20 to 30 years, world temperature has fallen, irregularly at first, but more sharply over the last decade. U.S. National Science Board, 1974. Glaciers in Alaska and Scandinavia have slowed their recession. Some in Switzerland have begun advancing again. Let's look again now at the complete Arctic sea ice graph going back to 1925. It shows exactly what we see in the historical reports. There was a lot of loss of sea ice prior to 1950s, then it started growing back again. And NOAA and the New York Times started their story right here at the peak. It's completely fake news what they're doing. It's junk science. It's fraud. Let's look at some historical reports now of the decline starting in the 1920s. This article is from the U.S. Weather Bureau Monthly Weather Review from November 1922. The Arctic seems to be warming up. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sailed the seas about Spitsbergen in the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures in that part of the Earth's surface. Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, they're now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared. Last winter, the ocean did not freeze over even on the north coast of Spitsbergen. This article is from 95 years ago, but this winter in 2017, the north coast of Spitsbergen did freeze over. So there's more ice in the eastern Arctic this year than there was 95 years ago. Here's another Arctic meltdown article from 1939. All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting, declared Professor Hans Almond, Swedish geologist. He was the leading Arctic authority at the time. It may without exaggeration be said that the glaciers of Greenland, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. And here's another article from 1952 from the leading American authority, Dr. William Carlson. He was president of 4 universities, including the University of Vermont. He said, "The glaciers of Norway and Alaska are only half the size they were 50 years ago." So the glaciers lost half their mass from 1900 to 1950. There was very little carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at that time. It averaged less than 310 parts per million. So the behavior of Arctic ice has nothing to do with carbon dioxide. The whole point of the New York Times article is completely fake news. And let's have a closer look at that again. This graph is from the New York Times article, and it shows the end of summer minimum way down here. But actually the 2017 minimum was up here. It was much higher. This graph was taken from data from the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado. It shows us that the Arctic sea ice minimum has been increasing over the past decade. Arctic sea ice isn't disappearing, it's increasing. This graph is also from the National Snow and Ice Data Center, and it shows that current Arctic sea ice extent is higher than 2007, 2008, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2015, and 2016. Arctic sea ice is increasing, not decreasing. Arctic sea ice extent is also in the grade normal 2 standard deviation range. There's nothing unusual going on in the Arctic. The ice is not disappearing. I predicted on my blog a few weeks ago that this fraud would occur. I wrote, "Instead of reporting the huge gain in ice and massive failure of their forecast, climate alarmists will report that extent was 8th lowest on record." And sure enough, that's exactly what they did. Here's the latest Google fake news about Arctic sea ice. Arctic at record low, sea ice extent shrinking, drops to its lowest recorded level. It's all a bunch of complete garbage. By cherry-picking their start date in 1979 and ignoring all the prior data, they create a fake downward linear trend, which has nothing to do with the behavior of the climate. Climate is cyclical, it's not linear. The New York Times, NOAA, and many other government agencies are committing climate fraud. They're not informing the public, they're misinforming the public. And one more thing before I quit. This is the current NASA global land temperature graph. Remember all that cooling that was reported after 1940, from 1940 through the 1970s? Well, that's all disappeared. NASA has completely erased that inconvenient cooling. In 1974, the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado showed this 1940 to 1970 cooling when the ice was expanding and Iceland's ports were being blocked up. But NASA has since completely erased it. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.